You can be for the environment or against plastics, but you can't be both. Because it turns out whenever you try and get rid of plastics, you end up increasing harm. So if you want to increase harm, the best way to go about it, according to science, is to be against plastics and replace it with other stuff. And that's undeniable. There's just irrefutable evidence. It's not even close.
Welcome to this edition of the Poly Podcast. My name is Peter Dyke, and with me is my colleague, Dan Landy. Welcome, Dan.
Good morning, Peter. This is an exciting one today. I know you've been trying to get some airtime on this topic for quite some time now.
Well, that's for sure. Hats off to David Fink, Dan, for having Chris DeArmitt speak at PPI. That's how I first became acquainted with him. And what a thought leader that guy is. And I'm so excited to bring it to our audience today. And before we get started, Dan, I just wanted to share, a top line for me, one of my, the thing that I'm so excited about our audience listening to Chris DeArmitt, and that is I'm thankful that there's somebody out there that's keeping track of this stuff. Dan, we have been listening to people complain about plastics for years now. And until Chris came along, we really didn't have the ammunition to share with them the counter argument or additional knowledge to help them make a more informed decision.
Yeah, I heard a while ago, someone used to say, nothing's more dangerous than an unchecked man, right? So if the other side is out there pushing whatever they perceive to be the truth and they're unchecked, that just becomes reality for everybody, right? If there's no one countering their arguments and actually getting some reason into the conversation, it's a very dangerous place to be.
Well, and I said that for years when I started working for the Alliance, Dan, that we were letting the ductile iron people and the and the PVC people define our place in the market because we didn't have a collective voice out there speaking facts and, quite honestly, following the science. And the second thing, Dan, that I find really compelling about this conversation that we had with Chris DeArmitt today is I learned from him to trust the science and follow the science because that's what it's all about. And we have always run a fact-based program here at the Alliance for PE Pipe.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of ways for other arguments to try to manipulate or nitpick exactly what they want to discuss. So his thoroughness of his breadth and depth of everything he's put together is kind of what validates his message. You could take one or two studies and say, oh, this is what we found, but it's very difficult to do that. Hundreds, I think he says even thousands of independent papers he's audited over the years.
Yeah, impressive. Well, before we get started, again, I'd like to say thank you, Dan, to WL Plastics, who's been sponsoring the Poly Podcast here for going on well over a year. We're very thankful for them.
Absolutely. Particularly Richard and Dusty really having an active role in helping us flip a lot of specs that are out there, particularly in these larger transmission lines. That's usually where we're getting them involved. And those are typically the ones that require a little bit more work to push them over the finish line. So we're very grateful for their service. Yeah,
we are. So that's WL Plastics. They're what we call a converter in the industry. They manufacture polyethylene pipe for all the many markets that Poly operates in. So thank you, WL Plastics, for sponsoring this webinar. And without further ado, Dan, let's get to the content of today. Dr. Chris DeArmitt speaking about plastics and polyethylene and the pipe market here in North America. Greetings and welcome to another edition of the PE Alliance's Poly Podcast program, where today we're delighted to have the support of WL Plastics, a regular sponsor of the podcast program and many of the Alliance's programs that we conduct every year. Today we have a special guest. His name is Chris DeArmitt. He's a PhD, and I first met Chris at a PPI meeting a couple years ago, and then David Fink had him back again at the May meeting earlier in 2023. And I'm like, wow, we got to get this guy on the podcast. Welcome, Chris DeArmitt.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
So, Chris, you told me pre-show that you live in Cincinnati. I love Cincinnati. How do you like it?
Oh, we like it here. We're in a little village just outside of Cincinnati because they have a good school district where we are, and my daughters are about 13 and 14, and that's how this journey began with my daughters. So if anyone's read the book, basically my kids came home from school and they've been taught complete nonsense by their teachers, and that's what made me angry enough to go and find all the facts, because I figured, well, how are the teachers supposed to know what the truth is? They're not scientists. So,
Well, I have the same attitude about the industry, and that is, here, the people on the front lines in our industry are salespeople. They're the ones that are talking to people and trying to convince them to use polyethylene as a fantastic pipe, and it truly is. And then you've got these elected officials and other ignorant, and I don't mean that in an offensive way, just lack of knowledge about pipe and plastic, and that plastic isn't this really bad thing that everybody thinks it is. Anyway, we're getting ahead of ourselves. So it started with you and your daughters, and what was it you heard from your daughters?
They were told that plastics don't degrade, and that's just an outright lie. I mean, I've read thousands of studies on plastic degradation. I was on 60 Minutes with Scott Pelley talking about how plastic degrades rapidly in the body and should never have been used for that application, for repairing within the body. So, and they say that there's a thing called the illusory truth effect. And that says that if you listen to something enough times, you start to believe it. Even if you're really intelligent, you will still be hoodwinked into believing something that's nonsense if it's just repeated over and over. So that's where we are now. We've heard these things about plastic over and over, and it all sounds reasonable, because why would anyone repeat it if it wasn't true? And the trouble is, the only way to break out of that illusory truth effect, according to the scientific studies, is if you know in the core of your being that the thing you're being told is a lie. And that's what I knew about plastic degradation. I'm an expert on that area. I'm an expert witness on it, right? And for class action lawsuits, I've read, as I said, thousands and thousands of articles, and I knew that was just an outright whopper. And so that's where the journey began. I already had the science on that to debunk that one, but then I had to do more work to look into litter and waste and ocean plastics and microplastics.
Well, it's kind of interesting, and this is a parallel with other things that our children are being taught in schools. It's kind of hard to keep the politics out of it, right?
Right. By the way, I have no political affiliation whatsoever. My opinion is, of all politicians, is rather low, so I stay out of that arena. I'm just a scientist. I go where the facts lead me.
Right. Well, speaking of that, you are a scientist. What kind of scientist are you, and how did it all get started for you? Tell us a little bit about your background and your education.
Yeah, I'm a PhD chemist. So I was sponsored in my undergraduate days by a company called Courtaulds in the UK. And at the end of it, they promised me a job. And the only trouble with that was when I came out, there was a recession going on. And they said, well, why don't we fund you to do a PhD, and then you'll pop out 3 years later and we can hire you then. So they funded me to do I did a master's, an MPhil, and a PhD in chemistry and polymer science, which means plastics. And one of the best experts in the world on polymer degradation, Professor Norman Billingham, was one of my mentors and tutors. So he really inspired me to couple things. One is he was very good at explaining things in a simple way. So I realized that science doesn't have to be boring. You can take something, really understand it, and the better you understand it, the simpler you can explain it to people who are not even scientists.
That's one of the things that I've learned. When I started doing this 13 years ago, Chris, I didn't really know much about polyethylene pipe. And, over time, I mean, just particularly the vocabulary, it took a long time to learn. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that I've really noticed about you. You really do have an ability, like your mentor, to explain complicated things in an easy to understand manner.
Yeah. The funny part is my clients say, oh, you don't have to dumb it down for me. I'm like, no, I'm not dumbing it down. This is literally how I think about it, because the better you understand it, the simpler it gets. So people who are using long words and hiding behind stuff like that, they usually don't understand what they're talking about.
So where was it you got your PhD? Was it here in the States or elsewhere?
That was Sussex University near Brighton on the south coast of England.
Okay.
So I did my master's, my bachelor's, and my PhD there.
Wow. So what's it like living in the States? Did you marry an American woman?
No, I'm married to a German woman. She's now got American citizenship. But so I'm a real American, as they say. I'm from Indiana originally, but I grew up in the UK, so I've got a funny accent.
Well, Indiana's a great state.
Yeah, yeah. I still
Indianapolis or elsewhere?
Indianapolis.
So Indianapolis?
Yeah, that's where my dad lives.
Got it. Very cool. All right. So you got your PhD in polymer science of sorts. And what led you down this path? What you became acquainted to me, or I became acquainted to you as a result of this book that you wrote, called The Plastics Paradox,
Right.
which is a great read. I think I'm on my third read. You got to read it more than once to really get some of the stuff. I mean, it's like anything in the plastic industry. I do anyway. I've got to read it. Congratulations to you on the book.
Thank you. Yeah, that was the most painful thing I've ever done because I had to force myself to read hundreds of studies on things I have no interest in. I don't actually care about litter or waste or marine plastics or any of that stuff. But unless you cover all the topics, you don't have a complete book. I'm a professional problem solver, and I know the only way to solve a problem is to really understand not just one part of it, but all of it. So I read opinions from experts. There are a couple of names spring to mind, which I won't mention, but some people only look, for example, at one topic and they come up with solutions that actually make things worse because they forgot to look at the whole picture. So that's why I had to cover all the different topics. I read 400 studies just to write the book, unpaid, of course, completely unpaid. The book was published on my own dime, and I didn't think anyone would ever read it. Nobody read my first book, hardly anyone. People who did read it really enjoyed it, but it got no exposure. So I was just so angry. I had to get it off my chest. I read all these studies. I wrote the book. And thank goodness I didn't make a hash of it because I would have been mortified if people had started reading this book and it was embarrassing and had mistakes in it. But happily, we're a few years on now, and nobody's found any factual errors in it. So, and it's reached a very wide audience. One company just bought 500 copies of it direct from the printer for all of their staff.
How did you publish it? Did you go to a publisher? Or did you do it on your own?
I did both. I went to a publisher. So my normal stuff, like encyclopedia chapters and so forth, is with the big publishers like Elsevier and Wiley and Springer and those guys. So I know the publishers there and the editors, and I went to them and they said, yeah, we love your idea, but we only publish really boring, dry science books that nobody reads, so we can't help you, right? They're the wrong kind of publisher. So I thought, oh, well, I'll just publish it myself because that way I don't have to kowtow to editors, people telling me what to say, what I can't say, and so forth. I can just say it exactly how it is without any biases.
So what's the top line for those people that are listening to this podcast? What's the top line on the book?
The first thing I would say is that people are relying on stuff that they've seen on social media, for example, and through the regular media. And at the same time, studies reveal that people don't trust what they see on social media and the media. So they know to be skeptical. They know they can't rely on it. And yet every single thing they've ever heard about plastic is untrue, completely contradicted by the science, and coming from the same media that these people say that they don't trust.
Sure.
So I get this. So the very top line is you can be for plastic, you can be for the environment or against plastics, but you can't be both. Because it turns out whenever you try and get rid of plastics, you end up increasing harm. So if you want to increase harm, the best way to go about it, according to science, is to be against plastics and replace it with other stuff. And that's undeniable. There's just irrefutable evidence. It's not even close.
So let's look at a couple for instances. What I got out of the book, my favorite one, Chris, I mean, I've got two. One is the turtle with the straw in its nose, and the other is the plastic bag syndrome.
Right.
Tell us about the plastic bag issue.
Yeah. So there are studies on bags and other things, right? So they've looked at what actually helps the environment and what people think helps the environment. So they did a study and they compared what people think to the real facts. And they found out that the things you can do to help the environment, according to people, is black bags. Number one thing you can do is plastic bags. Science says it has no effect whatsoever. Plastic bags are just insignificant. And in fact, replacing them increases harm according to 30 life cycle studies, right? So, and on the other hand, if you look at things that actually would help the environment, that means flying less, driving less, and eating less meat. And the trouble is, these things that would actually help, nobody wants to do those things. So what they do is they go around waving a cotton bag, feeling like a good person, because they weren't a good enough person to actually do what was going to help, right? They didn't want to make a sacrifice. They didn't want to go and check the facts. All they want to do is pretend to be a good person by saying that they're against plastic bags and waving a cotton bag in the air and merrily increasing harm. So that's I have a chapter in the book about virtue signaling. A lot of this is people trying to look like good people without putting in the work to actually be good people.
Well, it's kind of hard to blame the public when the mainstream media supports this notion that plastic bags are evil and plastic straws are evil.
Right.
Because when you look up in a tree and you see these plastic bags hanging there, like, well, that's terrible.
Yeah.
Let's blame that on the bag manufacturers. Let's blame it on Kroger. for
Yeah,
not letting us use paper.
I know.
But specifically, when you look at what, say, Franklin Associates said, what did they say in their peer-reviewed study?
Well, there are 30 life cycle studies on bags in the world. We're talking Canada, France, Denmark, everywhere. And every single one ever done says that replacing the plastic bag massively increases waste and fossil fuel and greenhouse gas and total harm. And I even had all those studies reviewed by a life cycle expert who said the same thing, because I wanted to double check, that these studies were valid. So that's incontrovertible that replacing bags or banning them or taxing them is a bad idea. And yet that's what we're doing now. There was a study came out from Fredonia just a couple of weeks ago. They looked at what happened after they banned bags in New Jersey. And the answer was they sold way more plastic, because now you had to, instead of using those flimsy little bags, they had to go and buy much thicker trash bags and other bags. And they got a bunch of these reusable bags, which of course they ended up with a closet full of those. They weren't reusing them. They were forgetting them every time. So you ended up selling more plastic. And in their words, there was exponential increase in greenhouse gas. And you have to ask yourself, why would anybody ban something when there's 30 studies saying that that's going to increase harm? It's not like a surprise that it increased harm, right? This is what amazes me, right? Let's say you're a senator or congressman or you're Greenpeace. You can literally type in life cycle bag into Google right now, and you'll find these PDFs. These studies are readily available to anyone with 30 seconds of time on their hand who wants to do the right thing. Or you can go to my website and download them for free.
Yeah, but Chris, you're the only one talking about it. I know. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, is trying to help get the word out. I'm a big fan of what David Fink's doing at PPI, and he's doing the same thing. And
me too.
I got the idea from him. So hats off to David.
A lot of respect for David. He's really fighting the fight and doing what's right.
Yeah, for sure. One of the other things I read in your book, which floored me, but makes total sense, because I know the bag that I carry into Kroger is kind of gross, right? But you had a couple pages in your book about the health effects of switching to a multi-use bag.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, it's kind of obvious if you think about it. If you put groceries in things again and again, they're going to you start growing mold, and you get, all kinds of toxins and stuff like that, spores and things building up. There was even a report of a big spike in health problems after a bag ban. I would say that the evidence on that is really flimsy. I could only find 2 studies when I was writing the book, and they both said that there could be health problems, and there were measurements of health problems. But I wouldn't say that was the most solid thing that I ever came across. It makes intuitive sense, though, if you take a bag and reuse it. And then, of course, if you don't want to poison yourself with your shopping bag, you have to wash it all the time. So now we have hot water, we have detergent, we have dry energy for the drying, and the whole life cycle and impact of that bag changes when you include the washing.
Chris, one of the things that I loved about your book is you stress an importance on the life cycle assessment. And, you really using science to determine the benefit of a procedure or a product. Right. Could you tell us, and this is something in our industry when we're trying to convince people to use polyethylene pipe that we rely on, but we don't really have good data yet. Can you tell us what an LCA is and how it might help our industry?
I was first introduced to LCAs by a friend of mine called Bengt in Sweden, and he was working for Pharmacia, one of the big pharmaceutical companies. And he told me that there was a life cycle analysis on glass bottles, and it only is green to recycle a glass bottle if the recycling facility is within 100 miles of where you pick up the bottle, because otherwise all the driving it in a truck counteracts the whole benefit of recycling. You end up with a net negative. Sure. And I was like, oh, life cycle analysis. I've never heard of that. And this is about 30 years ago now, right? So I was in my 20s. And so this has evolved over time. It's the only proven method to work out what causes more impact and what causes less impact. Everything we do causes some impact, right? So unless you want to dig a hole in your garden and jump in it and be done with it, right? We have to, instead of doing that, which I've yet to meet anyone who's against plastic, who stops typing on a plastic keyboard and stops using their plastic phone and turns off the electricity to their house, which is through plastic insulated wires. If we don't want to completely go back to living like cave people, what we should be doing is making wise choices, picking the option that causes least impact. The only proven way to do that is by checking the life cycle analysis, which adds up not just the greenhouse gas, it adds up the effect on the rivers and the lakes and the acid rain and the effects on animals and litter and all kinds of things, and the end of life even. So the disposal and the repair of the thing is included. And it's not just making the material, it's the actual use of that material. So, for example, if you put plastic in a car and it makes your car lighter, you end up spending, let's say, 1 unit of oil to make the plastic, and you end up saving 10 units of oil because the car is now lighter and the miles per gallon are better. So it looks at the whole picture, and it's regulated, this method, so you can't just wing it, you can't make it up, and it's also independently checked by experts to make sure you didn't cheat.
Right.
And even saying that, right, I would never trust one life cycle analysis because industries are very tempted to cheat if they can. And I've seen examples of that. So my approach as a real scientist is to download 30 studies on bags, every one ever published, and then send it to an expert and see what's what. And the answer is plastic bags are greenest. If you look at straws, you find out that the greenest thing is drinking water from a tap. And the second greenest is the plastic straw. If you look at pipes, there are 14 life cycle studies on that. And plastic pipes, PVC and polyethylene and polypropylene win every time. Metal pipes are vastly worse than plastic pipes.
Yeah, so that kind of brings us to, thank you for that explanation. I find that fascinating. They're also very expensive, Chris.
Yeah, they do cost $20,000 or $30,000, the ones that I've heard about. But what annoys me is people say, well, I don't trust life cycle analysis. I'm like, well, really, what are you going to do? Toss a coin? I mean, the idea that we should take the only proven method accepted by companies, governments, and NGOs in the world and fine-tuned over 30 years and throw it out the window and use a Ouija board to decide what's greenest? I mean, that's just pure insanity. But that's how desperate people are to demonize plastics. If you say there's 30 studies and they all agree about plastics, you're like, oh, well, I don't like life cycle analysis. I'm going to just cast aside the whole science so that I can retain my dislike of plastics.
Well, and I know you operate in a variety of plastic markets and spaces. I operate in a very finite spot, which is municipal and other pipes in the 9 major markets. And there are really only 2 plastics that operate in the space outside the building, and that's PVC and polyethylene, or HDPE. So I was, and understand that we can compete with PVC pipe, that I was interested in this entity called Beyond Plastics.
Right.
It's operating out of Bennington College. And it's not even a 501c3 or a C6. It's just operating as a quote unquote, a project within the college structure. At least that's my understanding. And they published a document a while ago, Chris, which I believe you're familiar with, that really went hard at PVC pipe. But we're being tarred with that brush. And they're basically, in that report, said how awful that PVC is. And what they point to is the train derailment in Northern Ohio, which is your home state, which was a vinyl chloride disaster. Could you tell us a little bit about that event and the way in which that organization is coloring it and then painting plastics in a negative light?
Yeah, well, it's in the name, right? Beyond Plastics. So they're not for the environment. They're literally, in their reason to exist is to be against plastics. And I couldn't really understand their motivation in the beginning, because when I compare what they say to science, so they testified to Congress, and I wrote a report literally going through line by line what they'd said, item by item, and just destroying it and saying, this is what science says, and what they say is the opposite, again and again and again. And I thought, how can they be so wrong about that? And then they started attacking PVC pipes, and very suspiciously, they specifically said we should be using copper pipes, right? So that's very suspicious. To be against one type of pipe is one thing, but to specifically endorse another one is highly suspicious. I mean, scientists don't usually do that. So I looked at what they said on the pipes front, and it was all wrong again. There was even a USA Today covered Beyond Plastics. And I wrote to the journalist and said, you've been hoodwinked into publishing misinformation. Please look at the science. And to her credit, that journalist, Emily Lacoste, she did look at the science, and she immediately published a correction once she'd been shown that she'd been misled by Beyond Plastics. So for the longest time, I was confused. Why are they saying things which not only are against science, but they're actually proven, scientifically proven, to increase harm, the things that they're recommending, right? And they claim to be an environmental group. And just a couple of days ago, somebody sent me the explanation. So it turns out that Michael Bloomberg has funded something called Beyond Petrochemicals, and he's funded another one called Beyond Coal, and apparently he's funding Beyond Plastics, right? This is his thing. He thinks that plastics are bad, and therefore he's throwing millions of dollars, presumably, not into helping the environment as he thinks. He's actually funding something which is having the exact opposite intention of what he wanted to do. He's against oil, but plastics actually reduce the use of oil. He's for the environment, but plastics actually help the environment. So if anyone knows Michael Bloomberg, please tell him to give me a call, because he's at the moment funding something which is having the exact opposite effect of what he intended.
Yeah, I was surprised. I listened to the entire webinar and watched it, and the logic train doesn't really pass muster because they are convinced that PVC pipes cause harm. And they admitted that if PVC pipes, I mean, they don't really have science that they leach anything, but if they did, it's in parts per trillion, Chris. And a part per trillion is a relatively insignificant amount of toxin. And I've always understood that PVC pipes are fully encapsulated the nasties, and that NSF 61 says these pipes are safe. Is that what you understand?
Well, there's multiple things to talk about there. So one is NSF 61 is the safety testing that goes on with all kinds of pipes. And it was pointed out to me that plastic pipes are tested at 3 different pHs, right? Alkaline, acidic, and neutral pH, like, regular pure water. The copper pipes actually fail that test at the 2 other pHs. They only pass at neutral pH. And that's totally unrealistic, right? My dad's got a crawl space under his house full of copper pipes with pinholes in. He's spent a fortune having repairs done on them because there is acidic and basic water, and that does corrode copper pipes. But somehow this NSF 61, which does apply to plastic pipes under these 3 conditions, they just skip the testing on the high and low pH for the copper and say, oh, well, it passes. So that's incredible to me. And so why does copper fail when you do it at high and low pH? And the reason is you get unsafe levels of copper dissolved in the water. And this is not some accusation from me, right? I had a guy come to my door, right, from the EPA. They literally test all the drinking water in the whole of America for lead and copper because they're both toxic metals. And they know that people are being exposed. It's not theoretical risk. There are people being exposed in all kinds of countries to unsafe levels of lead and copper. So the idea that these Beyond Plastics people, they're basically telling Congress is spending $15 billion. And the latest number was 30 billion, right, to replace lead pipes. So they're telling people to replace lead pipes with another type of toxic metal, right? When there's 14 life cycle studies that show that plastic pipes are the greenest, metal pipes vastly increase harm, their copper pipes are toxic, and they're vastly increased cost. Why would we spend $30 billion of our tax money on something which is less green, less safe, and costs more? It's just a waste of money. So this is how egregiously wrong these people are if you compare what they say to what science says.
Yeah, but also the logic doesn't make any sense just using raw data. So if you're talking about a PVC pipe at parts per trillion, and you're talking about copper, which, as you mentioned, the lead and copper rule limits the total amount of dissolved solids to 1.3 milligrams per liter. So they're saying it's toxic, but it's okay to 1.29. I mean, which doesn't make any sense. I mean, what I think the EPA is doing is they've got their hands full with lead, and once they get done with lead, then they'll go after copper. But they can't do both at the same time because they're imposing too much cost on the taxpayer or the ratepayer, if you will. Anyway.
Well, you made a good point about toxicity, right? Because people are always obsessing about parts per million of some stabilizer or some, safe tested chemical coming out of the plastic in tiny, tiny amounts. It's hardly anything in there in the first place. It's been tested for decades. When you take a copper pipe, it fails by dissolving, right? So 100% of that copper pipe is a non-intentionally added substance, right? Let's not talk about 10 parts per million of something safe coming out of polyethylene or PVC or polypropylene. Let's talk about the 100% of dissolvable copper pipe. And that's what happens. They dissolve away until they fail and they get holes in them. So it's totally illogical. And also, if you look at toxicity, I've got the safety data for polyethylene, polypropylene, and PVC. They're considered to be they're safer than table salt, right? They're as safe as the safest things we know about. You can literally eat them every day and nothing happens to you. That's been tested. If you look at copper, it's defined as extremely toxic. In fact, if you go, I made a website because I got carried away and read about 110 peer-reviewed studies on copper. So if you go to iscoppersafe.com, you can read a report with all the science about how dangerous copper is and how it's incredibly irresponsible to waste copper to make copper pipes, when what people are saying, how are we going to find enough copper to electrify and go electric, right, and save the planet and have electric cars? Whether or not believe in that, we do need copper for electricity. That's what it should be used for. And to waste it by poisoning ourselves and dissolving it and burying it in the ground in the terms of pipes is just, it's just beyond ridiculous.
I looked at one of the copper companies in preparation for today that sells pipe. And one of their arguments as to why it's okay that we leach copper into the water supply is that we need copper in our bodies to survive.
Yeah. We do. We do need copper. But what they found is that if you look at infant formula, baby formula, they put copper in there because it's important for the babies. But now if you make that formula up with tap water and it has copper in it, now you've got way more copper than that baby needed. And that's actually unsafe levels above the safety limits. So there's a reason that the copper amount that you're allowed to have in drinking water almost worldwide is about 1 part per million. That's how lethal it is. So this idea that, yeah, we should be, and the other argument you hear from the copper pipe people is, yeah, the copper that leaches out of the pipe is so deadly, it kills all the bacteria. Well, that's hardly reassuring, is it? And that's actually false in two ways. So if you look at the leaching of copper from a copper pipe, the initial blast when you install the pipes is huge and it does kill the bacteria. And it's also poisoning you, right? It's a high level of copper that you don't want to be exposed to because it is so toxic. And on the other hand, after about 6 months, the copper levels go down and now it's not killing the bacteria in your pipe. So they're selling you this dream that it's going to keep your bacteria out of your pipes. And it's just not true. There's no data to support that whatsoever. So it's
I don't want to give Beyond Plastics any more credibility, but they're the ones that people ask me more about than anything. So the final logic problem with that is their premise for this webinar, Chris, was, look, the federal government's going to appropriate $15 billion. They're going to try to get rid of lead pipes. We want them to use copper pipe, but we want them to make sure they don't use PVC, is what they said. We want you to use copper pipe, not PVC. Then they tell us how bad PVC is. Whoa. I mean, why would you say don't use PVC that might leach something at a parts per trillion, but use something that's a metal that's going to leach, to your point, 100% of its copper? Yeah. It's just, to your point.
Another argument. I went through their report, and you could read my rebuttal of their pipes report. I mean, I just ripped to pieces every single argument. One of their arguments was that plastics can burn and release dioxins, right? So if you burn PVC, and if you just type in dioxin EPA into your web browser, this is what happened to me. The first hit that I got was, where do dioxins come from? And the number one source of toxic dioxins is metals, the metals industry, including the copper industry. In fact, there was a copper production company that was fined millions of dollars for poisoning people with dioxins. So it's incredible to see that they're so obsessed with demonizing plastics that they have no fairness. They have no scientific objectivity. If you're really worried about dioxins, do a search for PVC dioxin and you'll find, the science on that and that it's not a real threat. And then do a search for copper dioxin. If you're gung-ho on recommending specifically copper, do your due diligence, be fair to the public, and show the truth, show both sides so that people can make a fair decision. And that's what I do as a scientist, but that's not what I'm seeing from them. They're apparently funded, it looks like, to just demonize plastic no matter what the facts say.
Yeah, so that helps us understand their logic and helps us understand their methods. And the final thing I'd say on them is, honestly, Chris, services these days, so we're talking from the main to the house or from the main to the office, they're either copper or polyethylene. PVC is not used in that way, primarily because it's brittle and it doesn't withstand freeze thaws well. And that 100-foot run is not below the frost depth, so they tend to break. So it's, they don't even understand that PVC is not even used for services. Nobody does it.
No.
They all use copper. They use polyethylene.
Yeah.
So there are
Another
only
thing I'd
two
like to
pipes
see is they
left.
don't disclose their funding. Why specifically copper? Does that mean that they're also funded by the copper industry to promote them and try and get them sales of copper? I mean, this whole thing is very murky. When I write a report, and when a real scientist writes a report, they declare any conflicts of interest at the end. And there's no such declaration in anything that I've read from Beyond Plastics. In fact, I got that journalist to question them and say, please give us a signed document that specifically says you're not paid by the copper industry or anybody else to say these things. And they wouldn't provide such a document.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's craziness. So back in when you spoke at PPI, you kind of gave a general assessment of the way plastics are perceived in the industry, and you had some recommendations to the audience to things to better understand, better explore. Could you share a little bit about what your thoughts were?
I would say the number one thing, if you want to solve a problem, is to spend 5 minutes to get the facts. So I've spent about 3,000 hours now reading 4,000 scientific studies, and I didn't have these when I started. So, and I've condensed it down onto one page because a regular person doesn't have time. So you go to phantomplastics.com, click the Plastics in the Environment tab, and you'll see the results of me spending thousands of hours unpaid. And then you can click on that and you can see the science for free with links to the peer-reviewed studies to back it up. So that's what I would do. And so if you do look at the facts, you see that replacing plastic increases waste, increases materials use, increases greenhouse gas, increases fossil fuel use, which surprises people, and increases total harm. And it actually increases litter as well, which no one talks about. That's been scientifically proven. So it's not that plastics are a great material. It's just they're the least bad of all the choices that we have. It's like democracy. Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government apart from all the other ones. And you could say the same about plastic. Plastic is the worst material apart from all the other ones. If you look at life cycle studies, and I've read hundreds, it comes out greener than plastic. It comes out greener than paper, metal, and glass every single time. The only thing that's ever greener than plastic is wool and wood.
Yeah, well done. And we're not going back to wood in the pipes anyway. There's
no, you
another
don't make a good computer out of wood.
I don't know if you have much experience with this one, but as you know, the West has been experiencing fires at a very high level over the last few years, and certain electric utilities have been paying that price in a big way. And there's been some similar, I wouldn't say as egregious as what's going on up at Bennington, but some egregious behavior by some scientists as to the negative effects of the combustion of plastic pipe and benzene. Do you have much experience with that?
Yes, I do. I looked into that.
Yeah, can you help us understand those
grasping at
issues?
straws. I mean, that's just really appalling. And there's several things to say. So they claim that there's benzene in this water after a forest fire, right?
Yep.
And the first question I'll ask yourself is, imagine this, there's a forest fire, my house burns down. Do I run back to the burning rubbles and find the nearest water pipe and start sucking water out of it? I mean, who is drinking water? There are guidelines after a forest fire. Nobody's drinking water out of any pipe immediately after a forest fire. You have to rinse them for hours and hours until there's no flavor and so forth. So the idea that there's some sort of health risk from people sucking benzene out of pipes after a forest fire is just preposterous. And the second thing to say is that they didn't compare to copper pipes, right? So if you look at solubility of copper at higher temperatures, it's much higher in the water. So if they were a real scientist who really cared about alerting the public to dangers, they would have compared plastic pipes and copper pipes. But those aren't even the two main egregious things. So this is the most incredible thing, right? They find benzene, traces and traces of benzene in the water, and go, oh, maybe it came from the pipes. Where else could it have come from? Go and look up combustion products of wood, and I have the science on this. You form tons and tons of benzene when you burn trees. It's one of the major combustion products of trees. So you're standing there in the middle of a forest fire with literally tons of benzene, because you're burning hundreds of tons of trees, right? Literally tons and tons of benzene. And this scientist is scratching his head going, gosh, where do you think this benzene in the water comes from? Could it be from the burning trees that are all around me? Or should I make up some nonsense that it's coming from the plastic pipes? So professional scientists have looked into this and said, hey, what happens is you create a vacuum in your piping system due to the heat changes in a forest fire, and that sucks in the benzene from the air from the burning trees. And that's what peer-reviewed science tells us. So these people who are so desperate to demonize plastic that they start to speculate that the benzene's coming from the plastic being heated. I mean, it's if it were up to me, these people would be thrown out of their jobs and forced to repay the taxpayers' money that they wasted on this nonsense.
Well, thank you for giving us the top line on that.
And as I said, it's not speculation for me. You can literally go down and, see the studies on the site. Go to iscoppersafe.com, and if anybody needs a study from me, and I'll send you a link.
Yeah, well, I was impressed with that work, and you said a couple times it was unfunded. So thank you for donating your nights and weekends to that kind of work, because it really has helped our industry come to terms with some of the things that we hear in the marketplace about how awful our products are.
Yeah.
And we often, Chris, we don't have the tools to argue these cases.
Yeah.
Because we're lay people. We're not. We're really not. This isn't our thing, right? Yeah. We're expert on polyethylene pipe and use and transmitting water and doing fusions. We're not experts on benzene and parts per trillion.
That's why I did it, because how are the teachers supposed to know what's true? How are the politicians supposed to know what policies make sense? At the moment, they're making counterproductive policies. I do get a lot of pushback from people saying, I don't trust you. You're a plastics expert. And I think, well, really, do you go to the hospital and ask to be treated by the janitor? I mean, surely you want to be treated by a medical expert, right? If you've got a medical problem, if you've got a plastics problem, you should ask to speak to a plastics expert. I mean, I wonder how many of these members of the public would, if Einstein were alive today, they'd walk up to him on the street and say, hey, this E=mc² thing? I'd like to give you some second opinions on that. I mean, the arrogance of these people, these lay people who've never read a single scientific study, and then question the person who presents literally hundreds and hundreds of studies with the links and quoted verbatim, right? And they want to question you. It's like, this is not down to my credibility. I'm just showing people the science that's already done independently all around the world. So that's kind of a wacky world we live in, right? People just see some internet gossip, never read a single study, and have the temerity to question somebody who's read 4,000 studies and share them for free. So that's unfortunate that people don't care more about the truth and doing good. And
well, I think your medical analogy is really spot on. You do go to the experts that understand the issues. That is without a doubt the question, and that's why we're talking today. All right, we're going to wrap up. I just want to ask you one more thing: is recognize that the people listening today are in the polyethylene pipe industry primarily, and some are specifiers and designers. What do you see on the horizon, or what advice do you have for us going forward to better understand our own products, other than going to phantomplastics.com?
Yeah. I mean, phantomplastics.com is my actual job. So I have some environmental stuff there, but you'll see what I do for a living, which is formulate plastic. So when it comes to polyethylene, it's one of the greenest, safest, and cheapest materials we have. Almost every life cycle study that tries to replace polyethylene increases harm. So the trends that I see for the future are polyethylene that's not coming from fossil fuel. The public are completely unaware that you can buy polyethylene that's identical to what's in pipes now, but not coming from fossil fuel. It comes from plants instead, so as the raw material. So that's a trend that's coming.
Chris DeArmitt, how does our guests get a hold of, our listeners get a hold of Chris DeArmitt?
Yeah, well, preferably not. I'm a busy man. Go to my website and read everything. So people always ask me questions which are covered in the book. They're covered for free on the website, and I can't individually write text messages to everybody all day long. So please start there. If you have a question, then I'll try to answer it. But
Perfect.
Please start by going to Phantom Plastics, click on the environment tab, and watch the video there. You'll see a one page that summarizes all the science, and then the video has the science in it. If you do that, you'll know more than 99.9% of people, and you'll be able to make smart decisions for a better future.
Well, it's awesome. I love listening to you today. I learned a ton.
Thanks.
Chris DeArmitt, we thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
For supporting the Poly Podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Bye for now.